now arrived at the last section of this process. The character's core looks and personality is put in place, and everybody is pretty satisfied with where it all landed. Now it's time to lock down all these ideas and present the final design. The last time we were looking at this design, we were left at these 3 versions we've made. These were my compromise iterations where I combined some of my favorite elements, like the softer green overtone and the intricate little design patterns resembling a ceramic teapot, while also making sure I kept the criticism in mind from the client. The client really likes A, but would love for me to use the darker color green from C as a base instead of the brighter green from A. They mentioned the overall values working a little cleaner this way, so that's what I'll be moving forward with. So this is the result of that combination. So I'm finally able to say that our brewer has officially been born. What is left to finalize is the render, and in this phase we paint over every part to clean it up as much as possible within the given time frame we still have left. We also do a pass on the materials and get them to read a little better. We have arrived at the part where the 3D artist will take over soon, so we need to be clear with what we want to pass on to her. I want to go over a couple elements and my thought process for them. The sleeves are pretty much kept the same as how I interpreted them from the references on my ref board. They are a semi-rigid material, so they keep their shape up by themselves, like in these. However, I didn't want it to be a typical blouse material, but make it a bit thicker, like a sweater material instead. A stronger material seemed more appropriate for her and her situation. I don't want to use too delicate materials, knowing she'll be adventuring a lot. Perhaps it's a bit much and falls into the overthinking category, but I do like to have the design not only be pleasing to the eye, but functional and strongly put together as well. No time to constantly patch up holes when you gotta make tea, you know? The front part that overlaps the dress, I wanted to be more rigid and sturdy. I see this part as a form of soft core armor. Of course, she isn't decked out in a full protection suit, but I can add hints of a sturdy material here and there to convey the impression that she's thought about self-protection. These are some of the references I used as an inspiration for it. For me, they perfectly overlap a protective look with a highly decorative and luxurious one. The same can be said about the rest of the dress. I want the whole off-white part of the dress to be slightly shimmery, like in this dress I found. Hopefully creating a strong blend between rigid and strong-looking materials and delicate and luxurious ones. Besides the clothing, I also touched up on the hair and the skin, rendering it so that it's making more sense and showing more volume. And overall just making sure it fits with the rest more. For the skin, I mostly softly mimicked the skin on the woman in this reference image. I want the skin to be this dark and cool undertone, just like this one. And these are the images I used as a reference for her hair. Our girl has her hair in an updo, of course, so it's a little tighter than the loose curls depicted here, but these come the closest to what I imagined her hair to look like, big and curly and slightly frizzy, but contained in a clean updo. At some point I mentioned that I really wanted to do a pattern call out. With this I meant I wanted to draw out the whole pattern as a 2D flat texture instead of on the dress itself in the render. I had a conversation with the 3D artist and she mentioned it would be really helpful for her stage. However, in the end, we didn't have enough time, so I did my best to make it as readable as possible on the dress itself in the render. and I leave it up to Mish to creatively interpret how it would look on the 3D model. The importance of figuring out the materials is mainly dependent on how based in reality you want the character to be once it's being turned into a 3D model. So there are a couple ways to do it dependent on the needs of your project. You can imagine a character that needs highly realistic textures would need a lot more carefully set up guide towards all the different materials needed. If there is adequate amount of time for this, a client might ask you not to just gather material references, but also take the time to photo bash or paint in all these textures on the 2D characters concept as well before it's being delivered to turn into 3D. This results in the least amount of guesswork needed on the 3D end of things. Everything has been taken into account beforehand and there is no miscommunication. And other times it's just a matter of aligning the found references and using arrows to point at what part of the 2D image needs to look a certain way. If we use what we've gathered to do that, it would look something like this, for example. For our character, we of course fall into the latter category. Since the character is highly stylized, we don't have to go too in depth like for a realistic character. However, we took it a step looser and I did not give the 3D artist a sheet indicating all the different materials like this example we created. Instead, I sent her a board with the references as more of a inspiration sheet instead of a fixed set of choices she absolutely needs to follow. I am purely creating a simple base where she can then use her creative freedom and adjust the materials in her part to something that would fit the best for the character. Once again, instead of this being a rigid process, this is more of a collab where we work together, and I wanted to make sure that the other artists are free to play around with some of my choices and can alter anything that they deem fit to improve upon the design. And I figured the best way to do this would be to not lock down everything yet when passing down my work to the next person. Of course, this is just talking about the materials. This might not be so important for our character, but what is considered important is the shape design we've established. For the 3D artist to accurately model out the proportions we decided for her, I need to make an ortho. An ortho is a clear-cut interpretation of the design of a character. We redraw the character completely in a semi-T-pose with no perspective manipulation whatsoever, usually depicting the front, the back, and the side of the character. If it calls for, we also draw out any hidden elements that might not be visible in 2D, but it still needs to be created in 3D, like the shape of her head under her hair, for example. We do this so that the others have an easier time translating the choices I do want to keep consistent as we move between artists. So let's head forward and I'll show you how I created one in the next part. Mish will join me for this section and we'll talk about the process from both our sides.